Blood soaked into the dirt path as 3 riders came out of the trees, swords already drawn. Illyra Marsh froze behind a wall of thick bushes, her heart slamming against her ribs so hard she thought it might give her away. She had only come this way because the healer's tent needed more moonflower root, and the shortcut through Blackridge Woods was faster than the main road. Now she was watching something she should never have seen. Ahead of her, on the narrow forest path lit only by torchlight, stood Alpha King Ronan Voss. He was surrounded. His personal guards lay scattered on the ground, some moving weakly, some not moving at all. The attackers wore no pack colors, no markings that Illyra recognized, which meant they had come from somewhere far away, somewhere with a grudge old enough to send killers across kingdom lines. Illyra pressed her back against a tree trunk and tried to make herself as small as possible. She was an Omega, the lowest rank in the pack hierarchy, and everyone in Ashbourne knew that Omegas did not interfere in matters above their station. She had spent her whole life being told to stay quiet, stay small, stay out of the way, but her eyes would not look away from the king. Ronan fought like something out of an old story, his wolf half shifted, claws extended, movements fast enough that Illyra could barely follow them. But even a king bleeds. She saw a blade slice across his side, saw him stumble, saw him catch himself against a boulder before pushing forward again. There were too many of them. She could count 5 attackers now, maybe 6, closing in from every direction like wolves circling a wounded deer. Illyra knew she should run. She should turn around, go back to the healer's tent, and tell someone in charge what she had seen. That was the sensible thing, the safe thing, the thing an Omega was supposed to do. But something in her chest refused to let her legs move in that direction. She thought of her mother, long gone now, who used to tell her that courage was not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. She looked down at the small leather pouch tied to her belt. Inside it were the herbs she always carried for herself, a mixture she had prepared months ago after a healer warned her that her weak wolf made her vulnerable to certain poisons. It was not much. It was barely anything at all against trained assassins. But it was something, and something was better than watching a king die in the dirt while she hid behind a tree. One of the attackers raised a dagger, and Illyra saw the metal catch the torchlight in a strange way, a dull gray shimmer that she recognized instantly. Wolfsbane. The blade had been coated in wolfsbane, a poison that could kill even the strongest alpha within minutes if it entered the bloodstream. Ronan did not see it coming. He was too busy fending off the attacker in front of him to notice the second one circling from behind. Illyra did not think. She moved. She burst from the bushes and threw herself forward, her small frame colliding with the king's side, just as the poisoned blade came down. Pain exploded through her shoulder, sharp and burning, spreading outward like fire under her skin. She had never felt anything like it in her life. The world tilted, and for a moment all she could hear was her own ragged breathing and the shouts of confusion around her. Ronan spun, catching her before she hit the ground, his golden eyes wide with something between shock and fury. He had felt the blade meant for him. He had felt it miss him because someone else had taken the hit instead. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice rough, his grip firm on her arms as he held her upright. Illyra could not answer right away. The pain in her shoulder was spreading, and she could feel her strength draining with each passing second. But she had come prepared for this, or at least for something like it. Her fingers fumbled with the pouch at her belt, pulling out a small vial of dark liquid, the antidote she had prepared for her own protection against poison, the only thing she owned that might counter what she now realized was already inside the king's blood from an earlier wound. "Drink this," she gasped, pressing the vial into his hand. "You've already been poisoned. I saw it on your side. This will slow it down." Ronan stared at the vial, then at her, clearly torn between disbelief and the urgency of the moment. Around them, his remaining guards were finally rallying, driving back the attackers, who now realized reinforcements were closing in from the palace watchtower. The tide of the fight was turning, but Ronan's face had gone pale, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool night air. "Drink it," Illyra said again, her voice weaker now. "Please." He drank it. He would later tell himself it was because there was no time to question her, no time to doubt a stranger who had just taken a blade meant for his heart. The bitter liquid burned going down, but almost immediately, he felt a strange coolness spread through his veins, pushing back against the fire that had been building inside him since the fight began. The last of the attackers fled into the trees as guards from the watchtower arrived, torches blazing, swords ready. But the battle was already won. Ronan stood on shaking legs, his side bleeding, his body still fighting off the poison, and looked down at the Omega girl now slumping against him, her shoulder soaked in blood, her eyes fluttering closed. "Someone get the healers," he roared, his voice carrying across the clearing. "Now." Guards scrambled into motion. Ronan lowered Alira gently to the ground, keeping one hand pressed against her wound to slow the bleeding, though he had no idea if it would be enough. He studied her face in the torchlight, trying to place her, trying to understand how someone so small, so clearly untrained in combat, had just thrown herself into the path of a killing blow without a moment's hesitation. "What's your name?" he asked quietly, leaning closer so she could hear him. Her eyes opened halfway, unfocused, her breathing shallow. "Alira," she whispered. "Alira Marsh." "Why did you do that?" Ronan asked, though he was not sure she could even hear the question anymore. "Why would you risk your life for someone you don't even know?" She did not answer. Her eyes closed, and for one terrifying moment, Ronan thought she had stopped breathing altogether. He pressed 2 fingers against her neck, searching for a pulse, and felt something loosen in his chest when he found one, weak but steady. "Hold on," he murmured, though he doubted she could hear him. "Just hold on." The head healer arrived minutes later, an older woman named Greta who had served the royal family for 3 decades. She took one look at Alira's wound, and at the strange gray tint spreading from it, and immediately called for more assistance, more supplies, more of everything. Ronan refused to leave the girl's side, even as his own wound was tended, even as advisors arrived and began asking urgent questions about the attack, about who could have sent assassins so deep into Ashbourne territory. "Later," Ronan said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Right now, I want to know everything about this girl, where she comes from, what she does in this pack, everything." One of his advisors, a sharp-tongued man named Caldwell, frowned at the request. "She's an Omega, my king. She works in the healer's tents preparing remedies. There's not much more to know." "There's clearly more than that," Ronan said, looking down at the girl's pale face. "An Omega who carries poison antidotes on her belt and knows enough to identify wolfsbane on a blade in the dark. There's more to her than her rank suggests." Caldwell said nothing further, though his expression suggested he found the entire situation deeply unusual. Ronan did not care what his advisors thought. He had spent years turning away every Luna candidate presented to him, every daughter of nobility, every warrior trained since birth to stand beside a king. None of them had ever made him feel the way he felt now, watching a stranger's chest rise and fall with uncertain breaths, knowing she had thrown herself into danger without a second thought for her own safety. The healers worked through the night, cleaning the wound, applying salves designed to counter wolfsbane poisoning, monitoring Alira's fading and returning consciousness with careful attention. Ronan stayed in the tent the entire time, ignoring every request for him to rest, to let his own wounds be properly treated, to attend to the mounting questions about the attack. Near dawn, Greta finally straightened up from her work and turned to face him, exhaustion etched into every line of her face. "She'll live," the healer said. "The wound was deep, and the poison had already started spreading, but she's strong, stronger than anyone gave her credit for, it seems." Ronan let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. "Good," he said simply. "Make sure she has everything she needs, whatever it takes for her to recover fully." "And where should she recover, my king?" Greta asked carefully. "The healers' tents are crowded, and given the circumstances of tonight, perhaps somewhere more secure would be wise." Ronan looked down at Alira's sleeping face, at the dried blood on her shoulder, at the small hands that had reached for a vial of medicine instead of running away. "She recovers in the palace," he said, "in one of the guest chambers. I want her watched over properly, and I want to know the moment she wakes." Caldwell, still lingering near the tent entrance, opened his mouth as if to protest, then thought better of it under the weight of the king's expression. Whatever questions the court would raise about an Omega being moved into the palace could wait. Right now, all that mattered to Ronan was that the girl who had saved his life survived to see another sunrise. As the first light of dawn crept over the treetops, Ronan finally allowed the palace healers to properly examine his own wound, though his mind remained fixed on the sleeping girl being carried carefully toward the palace gates. He thought of the years he had spent refusing every Luna candidate his council presented, certain that none of them understood what it meant to sacrifice something for someone else without expectation of reward. He had been searching for a quality he could not quite name, something beyond bloodline or beauty or political advantage. He had not expected to find a hint of it in the dirt of Blackridge Woods, in the actions of an Omega girl no one in the palace had ever bothered to notice. The morning brought chaos to the kingdom. Word of the attack spread quickly through Ashbourne, whispered from guard to guard, from servant to servant, growing more dramatic with each retelling. By midday, the story had transformed into something almost unrecognizable, though one detail remained consistent no matter who told it. The king had been saved by an Omega, a nobody from the healer's tents, a girl most of the pack had never even noticed existed. In the guest chamber where she now lay recovering, Illyra Marsh knew nothing of the whispers spreading through the kingdom around her. She knew only pain and darkness, and the distant memory of golden eyes staring down at her in the torchlight, asking her name, as though it actually mattered. 3 days passed before Illyra opened her eyes to unfamiliar surroundings. Soft sunlight filtered through curtains far finer than anything she had ever slept beneath, and the bed underneath her was so comfortable, it took her a moment to remember she was not dreaming. Her shoulder throbbed with a dull ache, but the sharp burning fire from before had faded into something manageable. She sat up slowly, wincing, and looked around a room that was clearly not the healer's tents she called home. A young servant girl near the door gasped and dropped the tray she had been carrying. "You're awake," she said, eyes wide. "I need to tell someone. Please, stay right there." The girl rushed out before Illyra could ask a single question. Alone again, Illyra pressed a hand against her bandaged shoulder and tried to piece together what had happened. Fragments came back slowly. The forest, the attackers, the king bleeding from his side. The vial of antidote she had carried for herself, given away in a moment she barely remembered deciding to make. She had saved the Alpha King's life. The realization settled over her slowly, heavy and strange, like a weight she was not sure she was meant to carry. Word must have traveled fast, because within minutes, the door opened again, and this time, it was not a servant. Ronan Voss stood in the doorway, dressed simply, compared to the ceremonial robes Illyra had always imagined a king would wear, though the authority in his presence needed no fine clothing to be felt. His eyes found hers immediately, and something in his expression shifted, relief mixed with an intensity that made her want to look away and stare at the same time. "You're awake," he said, echoing the servant girl's words, though his voice carried none of the same startled energy. He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. "How do you feel?" Illyra swallowed, suddenly aware of how she must look, disheveled and pale, in a bed clearly meant for someone far more important than an Omega from the healer's tents. "Sore," she admitted. "But alive, which I understand is more than either of us expected a few nights ago." A faint smile crossed his face, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. "The healers tell me you nearly died twice during the night, once from blood loss, and once when the wolfsbane in the wound started spreading before they could fully treat it." He moved closer, standing at the foot of the bed, his gaze never leaving her face. "You saved my life, Illyra Marsh. I don't say that lightly." Hearing him say her full name sent an odd flutter through her chest, though she pushed the feeling aside as quickly as it came. She was an Omega speaking to the Alpha King. Whatever strange debt he felt he owed her, it changed nothing about the reality of who they both were within the pack. "I did what anyone would have done," she said quietly. "No," Ronan said, his voice firm. "You didn't. I've had guards trained since childhood who hesitated during that attack, who thought twice before putting themselves between me and a blade. You didn't hesitate at all. You didn't even know me." Illyra looked down at her hands, unsure how to respond to that kind of directness. In her whole life, she had never had anyone in a position of power look at her the way Ronan was looking at her now, as though she were someone worth truly seeing, rather than someone to overlook or dismiss. "May I ask you something?" Ronan said after a moment of silence. She nodded, curious, despite herself. "Why do you carry poison antidotes on your belt? Most Omegas I know wouldn't have the first idea how to identify wolfsbane on a blade in the dark, let alone carry a remedy for it." Illyra hesitated, unsure how much of her personal history was worth sharing with a king. But something about the sincerity in his question made her want to answer honestly. "My wolf has always been weak," she said. "Weaker than most Omegas even. A healer once told me that certain poisons could affect me far more severely than they would affect a stronger wolf. So I started preparing remedies for myself, just in case." I never expected to use one on someone else, let alone the king. Ronan studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his golden eyes. How long have you worked in the healer's tents? Since I was young. My mother passed when I was 12, and the head healer took me in, taught me what she knew. It's the only life I've really known. And your father? Elira's expression tightened slightly. Gone before I was born. It was just my mother and me. And then just me. Ronan did not push further, though Elira could see the question still lingering behind his eyes. Instead, he moved to the chair beside the bed and sat down, an action that surprised her more than anything else that had happened since she woke. Kings, in her limited experience, did not sit beside Omegas as though they were equals. I want you to stay here in the palace while you recover, Ronan said. Properly cared for, with the best healers Ashbourne has to offer. And afterward, I'd like to discuss a proper position for you, something that reflects what you did for this kingdom, and for me personally. Elira's eyes widened. My king, I don't need anything in return. I only did what felt right in the moment. That's precisely why you deserve something in return, Ronan said, a faint edge of stubbornness entering his tone. You didn't act out of ambition or expectation. You acted because it was right. That's rarer in this kingdom than you might imagine, especially among people who've spent their lives chasing positions of power. Elira did not know how to respond to that, so she said nothing at all, simply studying the king's face and wondering what exactly was happening to the life she had known just days earlier. Over the following week, Elira's recovery progressed steadily under the careful attention of the palace healers. Her shoulder healed cleanly, the wolfsbane fully cleared from her system, though a faint scar remained as a permanent reminder of the night everything changed. During that week, Ronan visited her chamber almost daily, sometimes for only a few minutes between council meetings, sometimes for longer stretches when his schedule allowed. Their conversations ranged from simple things, like her favorite herbal remedies, and the small joys she found in her work, to deeper subjects, like the pressures of ruling a kingdom that constantly expected him to marry someone he did not love, simply for political stability. Elira found herself looking forward to his visits more than she wanted to admit, and she noticed, with growing unease, that Ronan seemed to feel similarly. The rest of the palace, however, did not share their growing ease with one another. Whispers followed Elira through every hallway she walked, servants exchanging glances when she passed, nobles openly staring as though she were some strange curiosity rather than a person recovering from a serious wound. She overheard enough fragments of conversation to understand that many in the palace considered her presence there deeply inappropriate, an Omega given privileges far beyond her station, simply because of one act of chance heroism. One afternoon, as she sat by the window of her chamber watching the palace gardens below, Caldwell, the king's sharp-tongued advisor, appeared at her door uninvited. He did not bother with pleasantries. I hope you understand, he said, his tone carefully polite, though the edge beneath it was unmistakable, that whatever gratitude the king feels toward you is temporary. Once the excitement of your rescue fades, things will return to how they should be. An Omega, recovering in the palace, is already an unusual arrangement. Anything beyond that would be a mistake this kingdom cannot afford. Elira met his gaze steadily, refusing to let his words rattle her outward composure, even as they stung more than she wanted to admit. I never asked to stay here, she said calmly, and I never asked for anything beyond what I already had before that night. If the king wishes to send me back to the healer's tents once I'm fully recovered, I would understand completely. Caldwell studied her for a moment, something like surprise flickering across his features before he composed himself again. See that you remember that, he said before turning and leaving without another word. Alone again, Elira wrapped her arms around herself and stared out at the gardens, wondering if Caldwell's warning carried more truth than she wanted to acknowledge. She had never asked for any of this, the palace chamber, the king's attention, the growing rumors that followed her through every hallway. All she had done was act on instinct during a moment of danger, and now, her entire world had been turned upside down because of it. That evening, Ronan arrived at her chamber later than usual, his expression tired from a long day of council meetings regarding the failed assassination attempt and its aftermath. He noticed immediately that something seemed different about her mood, and after a moment of quiet observation, he asked directly what was troubling her. Elira considered lying, considered simply saying she was tired, but something about Ronan's steady presence made her want to be honest instead. Your advisor Caldwell visited me today, she admitted. He made it clear that my place here is temporary, and that I shouldn't expect anything beyond simple gratitude for what happened in the woods. Something hardened in Ronan's expression, a flash of anger quickly controlled. Caldwell overstepped, he said firmly. What happens between us, and what position you hold in this kingdom, is not his decision to make. Between us, Illyra repeated softly, unsure if she had heard him correctly. Ronan seemed to realize his own words a moment after saying them, a rare flicker of uncertainty crossing his usually composed features. I meant, he said carefully, that your future in this kingdom is something I intend to decide personally, based on what you've done, and who you've shown yourself to be, not based on outdated ideas about rank and station that Caldwell and others cling to. Illyra nodded slowly, though the strange warmth in her chest at his earlier words lingered longer than she wanted to examine too closely. Whatever was growing between them, whatever unnamed thing seemed to be taking root during these quiet evening conversations, it felt far too dangerous to consider directly. Not for an Omega and a king, not in a kingdom that still saw her as nothing more than a temporary curiosity. But as the days continued to pass, and as Ronan continued finding reasons to visit her chamber, even after her recovery was nearly complete, Illyra began to wonder if perhaps some things mattered more than rank and station after all. The council chamber fell silent the moment Ronan entered, though the silence carried a tension that had become familiar in the weeks since the attack in Blackridge Woods. 7 pack elders sat around the long stone table, their expressions ranging from cautious respect to poorly hidden disapproval. At the head of the table, Ronan took his seat and waited, knowing exactly what subject would dominate this meeting before anyone spoke a single word. My king, began an elder named Miriam, an older woman who had served on the council for longer than Ronan had been alive. We must discuss the matter of the Omega girl residing in the palace. Ronan kept his expression neutral. Her name is Illyra Marsh, and she saved my life. I would appreciate if the council referred to her by name rather than by rank. A murmur passed around the table, some elders exchanging glances that Ronan chose to ignore. Caldwell, seated near the far end, cleared his throat before speaking. With respect, my king, the concern isn't her name. It's the growing rumor throughout the kingdom that you intend to name her as a candidate for Luna. Such a thing has never happened in the history of Ashbourne. Omegas simply do not become Lunas. I haven't named her as anything yet, Ronan replied evenly, though even he could hear the careful phrasing in his own words, the way he avoided denying the possibility outright. Yet, another elder repeated, seizing on the word immediately. My king, forgive my bluntness, but the kingdom needs stability right now, especially after an assassination attempt that suggests outside forces may be testing our defenses. A controversial choice for Luna, particularly one that breaks centuries of tradition, could weaken our standing among the other packs at precisely the wrong moment. Ronan leaned back in his chair, studying the faces around the table. He understood their concerns, even if he found himself increasingly unwilling to let those concerns dictate his choices. The other packs respect strength, he said finally. And if the tale of what happened in Blackridge Woods spreads, as I'm certain it already has, they'll know that our strength doesn't come only from bloodline or rank. It comes from character, from loyalty, from someone willing to sacrifice everything without expecting anything in return. Caldwell's jaw tightened. Character is admirable, my king, but it doesn't train an Omega in politics, in diplomacy, in the responsibilities a Luna must carry. Illyra Marsh has spent her entire life preparing herbal remedies in a healer's tent. She knows nothing of ruling. Neither did I once, Ronan replied simply. Everything can be learned, Caldwell. What can't be learned is the instinct to put someone else's life before your own, without a moment's hesitation. That instinct either exists in a person, or it doesn't, and I've met very few people in this kingdom who possess it as clearly as she does. The meeting continued for another hour, circling the same arguments from different angles, the elders growing increasingly frustrated by Ronan's refusal to dismiss the possibility entirely, and Ronan growing increasingly certain that his mind had already been made up, even if he was not yet ready to admit it fully to himself. Later that evening, restless after the tense council meeting, Ronan found himself walking toward the palace gardens, where he knew Illyra often spent her evenings, once her strength had returned enough to allow short walks outside her chamber. He found her sitting on a stone bench near a small fountain, her fingers gently turning the petals of a flower she had picked from the garden beds, an old habit from her years working with herbs and remedies. She looked up as he approached, offering a small smile that had become increasingly familiar over the past weeks. "You look troubled," she observed, setting the flower aside. "Council meetings tend to have that effect," Ronan admitted, settling onto the bench beside her, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her despite the cool evening air. "About me, I assume," Illyra said quietly, her gaze drifting toward the fountain rather than meeting his eyes. Ronan did not bother denying it. "The elders worry that naming you as a Luna candidate would create instability, especially given the recent attack. They worry about tradition, about what the other packs might think." Illyra absorbed this information silently for a moment. "They're not wrong to worry," she said eventually. "I've never trained for something like that. I don't know the first thing about diplomacy or ruling a kingdom. All I know is herbs and remedies and how to survive being overlooked my entire life." "That's not entirely true," Ronan said, turning to face her fully. "You know how to read people, how to sense when something is wrong before it becomes obvious. You know sacrifice in a way most nobles in this kingdom have never had to understand. Those are skills too, Illyra, even if the council doesn't recognize them as such." She finally met his gaze, something vulnerable flickering behind her eyes. "Why does this matter so much to you? You barely know me, Ronan. A few weeks of conversation doesn't change who I am or what I bring to this kingdom." Ronan considered his answer carefully before speaking. "Because for 3 years, I refused every candidate presented to me by this council, and every single time, it was because something felt hollow about the choice. They were beautiful, accomplished, well-trained in everything a Luna is supposed to know, but none of them ever made me feel the way I felt when you threw yourself between me and that blade without a single moment of hesitation." The words hung in the air between them, heavier than either of them seemed prepared to fully address. Illyra's cheeks flushed, and she looked away toward the fountain again, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. "You barely know what you're saying," she said softly. "The bond between a king and his Luna is supposed to come from something deeper than gratitude for a single act of courage." "I know," Ronan agreed, "which is why I haven't said anything to the council about naming you formally. Not yet. But I also know that what I feel when I'm near you isn't simply gratitude, Illyra. It's something I haven't felt with anyone else. Not once, in all the years I've been searching for a Luna who felt right." Illyra remained silent for a long moment, processing his words, clearly torn between the caution that years of being overlooked and dismissed had instilled in her, and something else entirely, something warmer and more dangerous that had been growing steadily since the night in Blackridge Woods. "The blood moon is coming soon," she said finally, changing the subject slightly, though the underlying tension remained unmistakable. "I've heard the servants talking about the old prophecy, how it reveals a king's true mate through some kind of sacrifice." Ronan's expression shifted, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his features. "I've heard the same whispers," he admitted, "though I've always considered such prophecies more superstition than truth. My father dismissed them as old stories, meant to comfort a kingdom during uncertain times." "And now?" Illyra asked, watching him carefully. "Now," Ronan said slowly, "I'm less certain than I used to be about a great many things I once considered settled." They sat together in silence for a while after that, the fountain trickling softly beside them, the evening air growing cooler, as the sun continued its descent toward the horizon. Neither of them spoke of the blood moon prophecy again that night, though the words lingered between them, a quiet undercurrent beneath every conversation that followed in the days ahead. Meanwhile, unknown to either of them, Caldwell had begun making quiet inquiries of his own, reaching out to contacts within other packs, trying to understand exactly who had sent the assassins into Blackridge Woods and why. The attack had felt too precise, too deliberate to be a random act of aggression, and Caldwell suspected there was more to the story than the council had yet uncovered. If someone had specifically targeted the king during a night that would later prove significant to the unfolding prophecy, then perhaps the attack itself had been an attempt to prevent exactly what now seemed to be happening between Ronan and the Omega girl who had saved his life. It was a theory Caldwell kept to himself for the time being, uncertain whether it would help or hinder his efforts to steer the king away from a choice that threatened to upend centuries of tradition within Ashbourne. But as he watched Ronan grow increasingly attached to Illyra Marsh with each passing week, Caldwell became more and more convinced that whatever force had sent those assassins into the woods that night, it would not simply disappear now that its first attempt had failed. Something larger was moving beneath the surface of Ashbourne's peaceful facade, and Caldwell feared that Elira Marsh, whether she realized it or not, had placed herself directly in its path the moment she stepped out from behind those bushes to save a king's life. Elira had never given much thought to her own history, not in any deep way, not beyond the simple facts she had grown accustomed to reciting whenever someone asked. Her mother died when she was 12. Her father was gone before she was born. She had been taken in by the head healer of the tents, a stern but fair woman named Petra, who taught her everything she knew about herbs, remedies, and the quiet art of healing wounds both physical and otherwise. But one evening, as she sat with Ronan in a quiet corner of the palace library, surrounded by shelves of ancient texts, most of which she could not read, he asked her a question that made her pause longer than usual. "What was your mother like?" he asked, settling into the chair across from her, a cup of warm tea between his hands. Elira considered the question carefully. "Strong," she said finally. "Stronger than anyone gave her credit for, much like everyone assumes about me now. She wasn't an Omega, actually. She held a mid-rank position in the pack before I was born, but something happened, some scandal I never fully understood, and she was demoted. She never talked about it much, and I learned early on not to ask." "Do you know what caused it?" Ronan asked, his curiosity evident. "Only fragments," Elira admitted. "She mentioned once, when she was ill, and not entirely herself, something about betrayal within the pack leadership at the time. She said she trusted someone she shouldn't have, and it cost her everything, including whatever relationship she'd had with my father." Ronan's expression grew thoughtful, and something in his posture shifted slightly, as though a piece of information had just clicked into place that he had not expected. "What was your mother's name?" he asked quietly. "Wren," Elira answered. "Wren Marsh, though I've heard that wasn't always her surname." Something flickered across Ronan's face, gone before Elira could fully identify it. "I need to look into something," he said, standing abruptly. "I'll explain more once I understand it myself. In the meantime, please don't mention this conversation to anyone else in the palace." Elira frowned, confused by his sudden urgency, but nodded regardless, trusting that Ronan had reasons for his caution that she did not yet understand. Over the following days, Ronan quietly requested access to the palace archives, searching through decades of pack records for any mention of a woman named Wren, who had once held a mid-rank position before some kind of scandal led to her demotion. It took considerable digging, and the assistance of an elderly archivist who remembered the era in question, but eventually Ronan uncovered a name that made everything about Elira's past suddenly make far more sense. Wren had once served under Ronan's own father, decades earlier, as an advisor specializing in herbal medicine and pack health. According to the records, she had uncovered evidence of corruption within the pack's leadership, evidence involving misused resources meant for the healer's tents. When she brought her findings forward, rather than being rewarded for her honesty, she had been quietly demoted and eventually pushed out entirely, her reputation quietly destroyed by those she had accused, who held far more power and influence than she did. The name of the man responsible for orchestrating her downfall stopped Ronan cold when he finally found it buried in an old council record. Caldwell. Not the current Caldwell, but his father, who had held a similarly influential advisory position decades earlier. The elder Caldwell had been implicated in the very corruption Wren uncovered, and rather than face consequences, he had used his influence to destroy her credibility instead, ensuring she was demoted so far down the ranks that no one would ever take her accusations seriously again. Ronan sat with this discovery for a long time, turning the pieces over in his mind, trying to understand what it meant for the present situation. Was it possible that the current Caldwell knew about this history? Was it possible that his persistent opposition to Elira's rise within the palace stemmed from something deeper than simple concern for tradition, perhaps a fear that her presence might eventually uncover secrets his own family had worked hard to bury? He decided not to confront Caldwell directly, not yet, not until he understood the full scope of what he was dealing with. Instead, he returned to Elira with careful questions, trying to piece together more of her mother's story, without revealing the full extent of what he had discovered. "Did your mother ever mention specific names?" he asked one afternoon, as they walked together through the palace gardens, a routine that had become comfortable and familiar over the past several weeks. People she blamed for what happened to her? Elira considered the question, clearly trying to dredge up memories that had grown hazy with time. "There was one name," she said slowly. She mentioned it only once, when she thought I was asleep. She was talking to herself, I think, working through old anger. She said the name Caldwell like it was something bitter in her mouth. Ronan's suspicions solidified into something closer to certainty. Elira, I need to tell you something, and I need you to trust that I'm sharing this, because I believe you deserve to know the truth about your own history. He explained what he had found in the archives, the connection between her mother's downfall and the elder Caldwell's corruption, the way an honest accusation had been twisted into a scandal that stripped Wren of everything she had built. Elira listened in silence, her expression shifting from confusion to shock, to something that looked dangerously close to anger by the time Ronan finished speaking. All this time, she said quietly, I thought my mother had simply failed somehow, that whatever happened was her own fault. She never told me the truth, not the full truth. She may have been trying to protect you, Ronan offered gently. If the family responsible for her downfall still held power in this kingdom, telling her daughter the full story might have put you both at greater risk. Elira absorbed this, her hands trembling slightly as the weight of decades of hidden history settled over her. And Caldwell, the one who's been opposing me at every turn since the attack, he's the son of the man who destroyed my mother's life? It appears so, Ronan confirmed. Though I don't yet know if he's aware of the full history, or if his opposition to you is purely about tradition and politics, separate from whatever his father did decades ago. Elira was quiet for a long moment, processing everything, before she finally spoke again. Do you think it's connected? The attack in Blackridge Woods, and this history between our families? It was a question Ronan had been turning over in his own mind for days, uncertain of the answer, but increasingly suspicious that the timing of everything, the assassination attempt occurring so close to the approaching blood moon, the persistent opposition from Caldwell specifically toward Elira's rise, could not simply be coincidence. I don't know yet, he admitted honestly, but I intend to find out, carefully and quietly, before we take any further steps that might put either of us at greater risk than we already face. That evening, as Elira sat alone in her chamber, processing the revelations about her mother's past, she found herself staring at the small collection of herbs still gathered on her windowsill, the same kind of remedies her mother had once used to serve an entire kingdom before everything was taken from her. For the first time, Elira understood that her own quiet resilience, the instinct that had led her to throw herself between a king and a poisoned blade without hesitation, had not come from nowhere. It had come from a mother who had once stood up against corruption despite the cost, who had taught her daughter, even without meaning to, that doing what was right mattered more than protecting oneself from consequences. Whatever opposition Caldwell continued to raise against her, whatever secrets still lingered beneath the surface of Ashbourne's political landscape, Elira found a new resolve settling over her that night, a determination inherited from a mother whose courage had been buried alongside her reputation, waiting decades for someone to finally bring it back into the light. News of the king's growing attachment to Elira Marsh spread through Ashbourne faster than anyone in the palace anticipated, and with it came a wave of reactions as varied as the pack itself. Some of the common folk, particularly those from lower ranks who had spent their lives being overlooked much like Elira herself, spoke of her with a kind of quiet admiration, a hope that perhaps the rigid hierarchy of the kingdom might finally begin to shift. Others, particularly among the nobility, expressed open disapproval, uncomfortable with the idea that an Omega might rise so far above her station simply through an act of chance heroism. Elira felt the weight of these divided opinions every time she left her chamber, every time she walked through the palace halls or ventured into the gardens. Servants who once ignored her now watched her with careful, calculating eyes, uncertain how to treat someone whose future status remained so thoroughly undecided. Nobles who visited the palace for various matters of business made little effort to hide their disapproving glances, though few dared voice their objections directly to the king himself. It was during this period of uncertainty that Elira first met Ronan's younger sister, Wyn, a sharp-witted young woman who held far less patience for tradition than most of the palace's older generation. Wyn found Elira in the gardens one afternoon, sitting alone near the fountain, and settled onto the bench beside her without waiting for an invitation. "You're the one who saved my brother's life," Wyn said, studying Elira with open curiosity, rather than the guarded suspicion Elira had grown accustomed to from most of the palace residents. I suppose that's one way to describe it, Elira replied cautiously, unsure what to expect from this new acquaintance. Wynne laughed, a bright, genuine sound that seemed entirely out of place amid the tension that had followed Elira since her recovery began. Don't worry, I'm not here to lecture you about tradition or station. Honestly, I think this entire kingdom could use a bit of shaking up. My brother has spent years refusing every Luna candidate the council has thrown at him, and none of them made him look the way he looks whenever your name comes up in conversation. Elira felt heat rise in her cheeks despite herself. The council seems to think differently about the situation. The council, Wynne said, rolling her eyes dramatically, has spent so long clinging to old traditions that they've forgotten kingdoms actually need to grow and change to survive. My brother is a good king, but even good kings can be blinded by advisors who care more about maintaining their own influence than about what's actually best for the pack. You mean Caldwell, Elira said quietly. Wynne's expression sharpened slightly. Among others, yes. I've never trusted that man. Not fully. There's always been something calculating about the way he positions himself, always seeming helpful while somehow steering every important decision toward whatever benefits his own family's influence. Elira considered sharing what she and Ronan had discovered about her mother's history, about the elder Caldwell's role in Ren's downfall decades earlier. But something made her hesitate, uncertain how much information was safe to share even with someone as seemingly open as Wynne. Instead, she simply nodded, filing away the confirmation that she was not the only one within the palace who harbored suspicions about the advisor's true motivations. Their conversation continued for another hour, ranging across lighter topics as well. Wynne sharing stories about growing up alongside Ronan, about the weight of expectation that came with being born into a royal family, about the loneliness that often accompanied positions of power that most people assumed came only with privilege and ease. By the time Wynne finally excused herself to attend to other matters, Elira felt she had gained not just information, but something rarer within the palace walls, a genuine friend who seemed to see her as a person rather than a curiosity or a political problem to be solved. That evening, as the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, Ronan found Elira in the library once again, this time accompanied by a thick book detailing the history of Ashbourne's founding families. She looked up as he entered, offering a small smile that had become increasingly natural between them. Wynne tells me you two had quite the conversation this afternoon, Ronan said, settling into his usual chair across from her. Your sister is refreshingly direct, Elira replied. Nothing like the careful diplomacy I've grown used to navigating with everyone else in this palace. Ronan chuckled softly. She's always been that way, even as a child. Our parents used to worry that her bluntness would cause problems within the court, but I've always admired it. There's something valuable about someone who says exactly what they think rather than hiding behind careful words. She mentioned she doesn't trust Caldwell, Elira said carefully, watching Ronan's reaction. His expression grew more serious. She's not alone in that assessment. I've been doing more digging since our last conversation about your mother, and I've found troubling patterns in Caldwell's recent activities. Communications with contacts outside our borders that don't align with his official duties as an advisor. Financial transactions that don't quite add up when compared against his known income. Elira's stomach tightened with unease. Do you think he's connected to the attack in Blackridge Woods? I don't have proof yet, Ronan admitted, but the timing feels too convenient. An assassination attempt occurring just before the approaching blood moon, at a time when the prophecy suggests my true mate might finally be revealed through sacrifice. And Caldwell's persistent opposition to your rise within the palace, opposition that goes beyond simple concern for tradition, given what we now know about his father's history with your mother. What are you planning to do? Elira asked. For now, nothing obvious, Ronan said. I don't want to tip our hand before I have solid evidence, but I've assigned trusted guards to quietly monitor Caldwell's movements and communications. If he's involved in something larger, something connected to whoever sent those assassins into the woods, I intend to uncover the full truth before the blood moon arrives. Elira nodded slowly, appreciating his caution, even as anxiety continued to build within her chest. The idea that someone within the palace, someone who held significant influence over the king's council, might be actively working against them, felt far more dangerous than any external threat. At least an external enemy could be seen coming. An enemy hidden within trusted circles could strike from any direction, at any moment, without warning. I'm frightened, she admitted quietly, surprising herself with the honesty of the confession. Not just for myself, but for you as well. If Caldwell truly is connected to whoever wants you dead, then simply removing him from his position won't necessarily end the threat. Ronan reached across the small table between them, taking her hand in his, a gesture that had become increasingly natural over the weeks, despite the careful boundaries they had both tried to maintain given their respective positions. We'll face whatever comes together, he said firmly. I won't let anything happen to you, Illyra. Not after everything you've already sacrificed to keep me alive. The warmth of his hand around hers sent a familiar flutter through her chest, though the underlying fear about what might be coming refused to fully dissipate. Whatever quiet plot was unfolding beneath the surface of Ashbourne's political landscape, Illyra sensed that the coming weeks, culminating in the arrival of the Blood Moon, would bring challenges far greater than anything they had faced so far. Outside the library window, the sun finally disappeared below the horizon, casting long shadows across the palace grounds as evening settled fully over the kingdom. Somewhere within those shadows, Caldwell continued his own quiet machinations, unaware that the king and the Omega he so desperately wanted, removed from the palace, had already begun to suspect the true depth of his betrayal. The days leading up to the Blood Moon brought a strange restlessness to the entire kingdom of Ashbourne, a tension that seemed to seep into every corner of the palace and beyond into the surrounding villages. Illyra noticed it first in the behavior of the wolves throughout the pack, an unusual agitation that even the calmest and most disciplined warriors struggled to fully control. Old stories about the Blood Moon prophecy, once dismissed as mere superstition by most of the younger generation, suddenly seemed to carry more weight as the actual event drew closer. Ronan felt the change most acutely of all. His wolf, normally a creature of careful discipline and controlled strength, had grown increasingly restless in recent weeks, particularly whenever Illyra was near. He found himself drawn to her chamber more frequently than propriety strictly allowed, found his thoughts wandering to her throughout council meetings and diplomatic discussions that once would have commanded his full attention without difficulty. Something is happening to me, he confessed to her one evening, as they sat together in the private garden reserved for the royal family, a space Illyra had only recently been given permission to access. My wolf grows more restless with each passing day, and I don't fully understand why. Illyra set aside the book she had been reading, giving him her full attention. What does it feel like? She asked. Ronan considered the question carefully, searching for words to describe a sensation that defied easy explanation. Like something is pulling me toward you, constantly, even when we're not in the same room. When I'm in council meetings, my mind keeps drifting to whether you're safe, whether you're comfortable, whether something might happen to you while I'm occupied elsewhere. It's not something I've ever experienced before, not even with the most serious candidates the council has presented over the years. Illyra felt her own heart quicken at his words, recognizing echoes of similar sensations within herself, though she had been reluctant to name them clearly, even in her own private thoughts. Do you think it's connected to the prophecy? She asked carefully. The Blood Moon revealing a king's true mate through sacrifice? I've tried to dismiss the idea, Ronan admitted. For years, I considered such prophecies little more than old stories meant to comfort a kingdom during uncertain times. But everything that's happened since the attack in Blackridge Woods, the timing, the way my wolf responds to your presence, the sense of connection I feel with you that I've never experienced with anyone else, it's becoming harder to dismiss as mere coincidence. The pack elders, meanwhile, had grown increasingly vocal in their own discussions about the approaching Blood Moon, some treating it with the reverence of ancient tradition, others privately expressing skepticism about whether the old prophecy held any real truth. Miriam, the elder who had first raised concerns about Illyra's presence in the palace during the council meeting weeks earlier, approached Ronan privately one afternoon with a proposition that surprised him. My king, she said, finding him alone in his study, I've spent considerable time researching the historical accounts of previous blood moons within our pack's records. I believe there may be more truth to the old prophecy than either of us initially assumed. Ronan set aside the documents he had been reviewing, giving her his full attention. What have you found? Miriam produced an ancient scroll, its edges worn with age, and carefully unrolled it across his desk. This account describes the last blood moon to occur exactly 100 years ago, during the reign of your great-grandfather. According to this record, his true mate was revealed not through courtship or arranged matches, but through an act of sacrifice, during the days leading up to the blood moon itself. A servant girl, much like your own situation, who threw herself into danger to protect him from an assassination attempt remarkably similar to the one you survived in Blackridge Woods. Ronan's eyes widened as he studied the ancient text, recognizing patterns that mirrored his own recent experiences with uncomfortable precision. You're suggesting this has happened before, in exactly this pattern? I'm suggesting, Miriam said carefully, that the prophecy may not simply predict a king's true mate through random chance, but that it may actively influence events to create the exact circumstances necessary for that mate to reveal themselves. Sacrifice during moments of genuine danger, occurring specifically in the period leading up to the blood moon, when the boundary between fate and choice grows thin, according to our oldest traditions. The implications of this discovery settled heavily over Ronan, as he considered what it might mean for the assassination attempt that had brought Illyra into his life. If the prophecy itself had somehow influenced the circumstances of that attack, then perhaps understanding who orchestrated it might reveal more about the nature of fate itself, about whether choices made during such pivotal moments were truly choices at all, or simply the unfolding of a predetermined pattern that had played out before across generations. Does the record mention who orchestrated the assassination attempt during your great-grandfather's time? Ronan asked, already suspecting the answer would prove significant. Miriam's expression grew more solemn. The record suggests it was orchestrated by rival factions within the pack itself, individuals who feared the political implications of a king bonding with someone outside traditional noble bloodlines. Sound familiar, my king? It did sound uncomfortably familiar, echoing the very concerns Caldwell had voiced so persistently throughout the council meetings regarding Illyra's rise within the palace. Ronan thanked Miriam for her research and promised to consider its implications carefully, though privately, he found himself increasingly convinced that the pattern described in the ancient record was repeating itself in the present day, with Caldwell playing a role disturbingly similar to whatever faction had opposed his great-grandfather's chosen mate a century earlier. That evening, Ronan shared Miriam's discovery with Illyra, watching her expression shift from curiosity to concern as she absorbed the historical parallel to their own situation. If the pattern holds true, she said slowly, then whoever orchestrated the attack in Blackridge Woods did so specifically to prevent the blood moon prophecy from unfolding, or perhaps to manipulate its outcome in some way we don't yet understand. That's my concern as well, Ronan agreed, which means the threat against us isn't finished. Not by any measure. If Caldwell, or whoever he's working with, understands the significance of the approaching blood moon, they'll likely attempt something again before the event itself arrives. The weight of this realization settled over both of them as they sat together in the growing darkness of the evening, the distant sound of the palace preparing for the approaching celebration marking the growing tension throughout the entire kingdom. Whatever force had set these events into motion, whether ancient prophecy or deliberate manipulation, Illyra sensed that the coming days would demand courage, far beyond anything she had faced even during the terrifying moments in Blackridge Woods. We need to be more careful, she said finally, breaking the silence between them. Not just for our own safety, but because if this pattern truly does repeat the events of a century ago, then whoever opposes us understands exactly what's at stake as the blood moon approaches. Ronan nodded in agreement, reaching for her hand once more, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing over the past weeks, despite the boundaries they had both tried to maintain. Whatever happens, he said quietly, I want you to know that my feelings for you aren't simply the result of some ancient prophecy pulling us together. Even without the blood moon, even without whatever fate seems to be guiding these events, I would still choose you, Illyra. Every single time. Her breath caught at the sincerity in his words, and for the first time since the whole strange journey began in the woods that fateful night, Illyra allowed herself to fully believe that whatever connection had grown between them was real, deeper than mere circumstance or ancient prophecy, a bond built on genuine understanding and mutual respect that no amount of political opposition or hidden conspiracy could easily unravel. But even as she allowed herself this moment of hope, the shadow of the approaching threat lingered at the edges of her thoughts, a reminder that whatever peace they had found together remained fragile, vulnerable to forces still working quietly to tear it apart before the blood moon could fully reveal what fate, or perhaps simple human choice, had already set into motion. Petra, the head healer who had raised Illyra since childhood, arrived at the palace unannounced on a gray morning, nearly a week before the blood moon was set to rise. Alira had not seen her mentor since the night in Blackridge Woods, and the sight of Petra's familiar weathered face brought an unexpected rush of emotion, a reminder of the simpler life she had known, before everything changed so dramatically. "You look well," Petra said, studying Alira with the same critical eye she had always used when assessing a patient's recovery. "Better than well, actually. The palace seems to agree with you, despite everything I've heard whispered through the villages about the difficulties you've faced here." Alira embraced her old mentor warmly, grateful for a familiar presence amid the constant uncertainty that had defined her recent weeks. "It's good to see you, Petra. I've missed the tents, the work, the simplicity of it all." "Simplicity," Petra repeated with a knowing smile. "I doubt anything about your life remains simple these days, child. Not with the king visiting your chamber daily, and the entire kingdom whispering about prophecies and blood moons." Alira flushed slightly, though she made no attempt to deny the truth of Petra's observation. "How much have you heard?" "Enough," Petra said, settling into a chair within the small sitting room attached to Alira's chamber. "Though I suspect there's more to this story than the palace rumors capture accurately. I came because I believe it's time you learned the full truth about your mother, truths I've kept from you out of a promise I made to her before she passed." Alira's heart quickened, remembering the partial history Ronan had already uncovered about Ren's downfall decades earlier. "I already know some of it," she said. About the corruption she uncovered, about how the elder Caldwell destroyed her reputation to protect his own family's influence. Petra's expression grew solemn. "Then you know part of the story, but not all of it. Your mother wasn't simply an advisor who stumbled upon corruption by chance, Alira. She was specifically placed within the pack leadership to investigate suspicions that had been growing for years, suspicions about misused resources meant for the most vulnerable members of our pack, the sick, the elderly, the Omegas, who had no voice to advocate for themselves." "Placed by whom?" Alira asked, leaning forward with growing intensity. "By the previous head healer, my own mentor, who recognized your mother's sharp intelligence and unwavering commitment to justice, even as a young woman. Ren volunteered for the position, knowing full well the risks involved, understanding that if she uncovered evidence against powerful families within the pack, she would likely face consequences far beyond simple demotion." Alira absorbed this information slowly, understanding now that her mother's sacrifice had been even more deliberate than she previously realized, a conscious choice to risk everything for the sake of people who had no power to protect themselves. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" she asked. "Because your mother made me promise, before she passed, that I would protect you from the full truth, until you were ready to hear it, until you had built a life of your own strength, rather than living in the shadow of her sacrifice." Petra reached out, taking Alira's hands in her own weathered ones. She feared that knowing too much too soon might make you reckless, might push you toward confronting powerful enemies before you had the strength and position to survive such a confrontation. "And now?" Alira asked. "Why tell me now?" "Because now you have exactly what she lacked when she first attempted her investigation. The protection and support of the Alpha King himself, and a strength of character that has already proven itself capable of standing against overwhelming danger, without hesitation. Your mother would be proud of what you've become, Alira, though I suspect she would also worry about the dangers still surrounding you." Alira sat with this revelation for a long moment, feeling the weight of her mother's legacy settling more fully onto her shoulders than it ever had before. Whatever quiet resentment she had once carried, believing her mother had simply failed and been demoted through some personal shortcoming, transformed now into a deep and abiding respect for a woman who had knowingly sacrificed everything for the sake of people society had deemed unworthy of protection. "There's something else," Petra continued, her expression growing even more serious. "Something I only recently learned myself, through contacts I've maintained within the healers' network across other packs. The current Caldwell, the son who now serves as the king's advisor, was aware of his father's corruption from a young age. He didn't simply inherit a position of influence innocently. He actively helped his father cover the evidence that would have proven your mother's accusations, manipulating records and testimonies to ensure the scandal fell entirely on her shoulders instead. This information landed like a physical blow, confirming suspicions that Alira and Ronan had already begun to form, but adding a new layer of deliberate cruelty to Caldwell's role in her mother's downfall. He's known this whole time, she said quietly. Known exactly what his family did to my mother, and yet he's spent weeks opposing my presence here, as though I'm the one bringing instability to this kingdom. Which suggests, Petra said carefully, that his opposition to you runs far deeper than simple concern for tradition. If he fears you might eventually uncover the full truth about his family's corruption, truth that could destroy his own standing within the council, then he has every incentive to ensure you never gain enough influence or trust within the palace to pursue such an investigation. Elira's mind raced through the implications of this revelation, connecting it to everything Ronan had already discovered about Caldwell's suspicious communications and financial transactions in the weeks since the attack. If Caldwell had orchestrated the assassination attempt specifically to prevent her rise within the palace, understanding on some level that her presence threatened to eventually expose his family's decades-old corruption, then the danger they faced extended far beyond simple political maneuvering. I need to tell Ronan everything you've shared, Elira said, rising from her seat with new determination. This changes everything about how we need to approach the coming days before the blood moon. Petra nodded, understanding the urgency in Elira's voice. Be careful, child. A man who has spent his entire life protecting a family secret this significant will not simply surrender when confronted. He'll fight with everything he has to ensure the truth never comes to light, especially now that the stakes have grown so much higher with the blood moon prophecy potentially unfolding exactly as it did a century ago. Elira found Ronan within the hour, sharing every detail Petra had revealed about her mother's deliberate investigation, about Caldwell's active participation in covering his father's corruption, about the very real possibility that his opposition to her presence stemmed from fear of exposure rather than simple traditional concerns. Ronan listened with growing intensity, his expression darkening as the full picture came together. This confirms what I've suspected for weeks, he said once she finished. Caldwell isn't simply a traditionalist worried about political stability. He's actively working to protect a secret that could destroy his family's standing entirely, and he's willing to risk assassination attempts, willing to manipulate an entire kingdom's political landscape to ensure that secret remains buried. What do we do now? Elira asked. Ronan's expression grew resolute, the careful patience he had maintained throughout their investigation, finally giving way to decisive action. Now we gather enough evidence to expose him completely, before the blood moon arrives, and he attempts something even more desperate to prevent whatever the prophecy intends to reveal. I have trusted guards already monitoring his movements. It's time to move more aggressively, to ensure we have concrete proof before he realizes just how much we already know. As Ronan moved to summon his most trusted advisors for an urgent private meeting, Elira remained standing near the window of her chamber, watching the gray morning light filter across the palace gardens below. Whatever her mother had sacrificed decades earlier, whatever quiet courage had led Ren to risk everything for justice, Elira felt that same fire igniting within her own chest now, a determination to finish what her mother had started, regardless of the danger that still lingered ahead as the blood moon continued its slow, inevitable approach. 2 nights before the blood moon was set to rise, Ronan summoned his most trusted guards to a private meeting within his personal study, a room secured against any possibility of eavesdropping. Captain Aldrich, a broad-shouldered warrior who had served the royal family for over a decade, presented the evidence his team had gathered during weeks of careful surveillance. My king, Aldrich began, spreading a series of documents across the desk. We've confirmed regular communications between Caldwell and representatives from the Thornwood Pack, our closest rival territory. These messages, intercepted over the past 3 weeks, discuss payment arrangements and specific timing requests that align precisely with the approaching blood moon. Ronan studied the documents carefully, his jaw tightening as the evidence confirmed what he had suspected for days. He's been coordinating with Thornwood directly, arranging for the assassination attempt and likely planning something further before the blood moon fully rises. There's more, my king, Aldrich continued. Financial records show substantial payments received by Caldwell over the past 2 months, far exceeding his official salary as an advisor. The timing of these payments corresponds directly with increased communication activity with Thornwood representatives. Elira, who had been permitted to attend this meeting despite the unusual nature of an Omega's presence in such discussions, leaned forward with growing concern. Do we know what Thornwood hopes to gain from preventing the blood moon prophecy from unfolding naturally? Aldrich nodded grimly. Our intelligence suggests Thornwood fears a strengthened Ashbourne, particularly if the prophecy proves true, and creates a bond between you, my king, and someone who represents genuine change within our traditional hierarchy. A kingdom unified by such a powerful bond might pose a greater challenge to Thornwood's own territorial ambitions along our shared border. Ronan absorbed this information, understanding now the full scope of the conspiracy threatening not just his own life, but the stability of his entire kingdom. We need to move immediately, he said. If Caldwell and Thornwood are planning something for the night of the blood moon itself, we cannot wait for them to strike first. What do you propose, my king? Aldrich asked. Ronan considered the options carefully, weighing the risks of each approach. We confront Caldwell directly, but only once we have him isolated from any opportunity to warn his Thornwood contacts or destroy remaining evidence. I want him detained quietly, without alerting the rest of the council or creating panic throughout the kingdom, before we fully understand the extent of this conspiracy. The plan they developed that evening required careful coordination. Aldrich would arrange for Caldwell to be summoned to a private meeting, under the pretense of discussing routine matters related to the upcoming blood moon celebrations, providing an opportunity to detain him without alerting his allies to the fact that his conspiracy had been uncovered. Meanwhile, additional guards would be positioned throughout the palace, prepared for any retaliatory action Thornwood might attempt once they realized their inside contact had been compromised. Elira listened to the careful planning with growing unease, understanding that whatever happened over the coming days would likely determine not just her own fate, but the future stability of the entire kingdom. What role do you want me to play in all this? She asked, addressing Ronan directly. I want you protected, Ronan said immediately, his tone leaving no room for argument. Additional guards will be stationed near your chamber, and I want you to remain within the palace's most secure areas until we've fully resolved this situation. Elira's expression tightened with frustration. I understand your concern, Ronan, but I've already proven I'm capable of acting decisively when danger presents itself. Hiding away while others face the risk feels wrong, especially given that this entire conspiracy connects directly to my own family's history. Ronan met her gaze steadily, understanding her frustration, even as his protective instincts warred against the practical wisdom of her argument. I'm not questioning your capability, Elira. I'm trying to ensure that whatever Caldwell or Thornwood attempts next, they cannot use you as leverage against me. If they succeeded once in nearly poisoning me during that attack in the woods, I have no doubt they would attempt something even more direct against you if given the opportunity. The tension between them remained unresolved as the meeting concluded, guards dispatching to their assigned positions throughout the palace, while Aldrich prepared to summon Caldwell for what the advisor would believe was a routine discussion the following morning. Elira retreated to her chamber that night with a heavy heart, understanding the wisdom in Ronan's caution, even as every instinct within her rebelled against passivity, while danger continued building around them. The following morning arrived with a tension that seemed to permeate every corner of the palace. Aldrich summoned Caldwell to a private study under the agreed pretense, guards positioned discreetly throughout the surrounding hallways in case the advisor attempted any form of resistance or escape. Ronan waited within the study itself, his expression carefully composed, despite the anger simmering beneath his controlled exterior. Caldwell entered the room with his usual confident bearing, clearly unaware of the trap that had been carefully constructed around him. My king, he said, offering a respectful bow. Captain Aldrich mentioned you wished to discuss preparations for the blood moon celebrations. That's not entirely accurate, Ronan said, his voice cold and controlled. I wish to discuss your communications with Thornwood Pack representatives over the past several weeks, and the substantial payments you've received, in exchange for information regarding my movements and schedule. Caldwell's confident expression faltered, a flash of panic crossing his features before he quickly composed himself once more. My king, I don't understand what you're suggesting. Whatever information you believe you've uncovered must be some kind of misunderstanding. There's no misunderstanding, Ronan said, gesturing toward Aldrich, who produced the intercepted documents and financial records that had been gathered over weeks of careful surveillance. We have detailed records of every communication, every payment, every arrangement made with Thornwood contacts regarding the assassination attempt in Blackridge Woods, and whatever further plans you've been coordinating for the blood moon itself. Caldwell's face drained of color as he studied the evidence spread before him, understanding immediately that any attempt at denial would prove futile against such comprehensive documentation. "You don't understand the full situation," he said finally, his voice taking on a desperate edge. "This kingdom cannot survive the changes that would come from allowing an Omega to rise to the position of Luna. I did what was necessary to protect Ashbourne's stability, even if my methods were unconventional." "Unconventional," Ronan repeated, his tone dripping with barely controlled fury. "You call orchestrating an assassination attempt against your own king unconventional? You call betraying your position of trust to a rival pack that seeks to weaken Ashbourne unconventional? I didn't intend for you to be seriously harmed," Caldwell protested. "The plan was simply to eliminate the Omega Girl before she could interfere with the natural order of succession. Your death was never the true objective, merely a risk I was willing to accept, given the greater stakes involved." This admission sent a fresh wave of anger through Ronan, understanding now that Illyra had been the primary target all along, with his own near death simply an accepted consequence of Caldwell's desperate attempt to eliminate her before she could rise to any position of genuine influence. "And your father's corruption decades ago, the destruction of Ren Marsh's reputation and career, was that also simply necessary for the kingdom's stability?" Caldwell's eyes widened with genuine shock, clearly not expecting Ronan to have uncovered that particular piece of buried history. "How do you know about that?" "It doesn't matter how I know," Ronan said firmly. "What matters is that your family has spent decades protecting corruption and betrayal behind a facade of concern for tradition and stability. That ends now, Caldwell. You will be detained pending a full investigation into your activities, and any further attempts to communicate with Thornwood or interfere with palace security will be met with the harshest consequences our laws allow." Guards moved forward to detain the former advisor, his expression shifting from panic to a kind of resigned bitterness as he realized the full extent of his exposure. "This won't stop what's already been set in motion," he said, as guards led him from the study. "Thornwood has other plans, other contacts within this kingdom you haven't yet uncovered. The Blood Moon will not proceed as peacefully as you hope, my king." His words lingered ominously in the study long after guards had escorted him away to secure detention, a warning that despite this significant victory, the full conspiracy against Ronan and Illyra had not yet been completely dismantled. As Ronan absorbed the weight of Caldwell's parting threat, he found himself more determined than ever to ensure Illyra's safety through whatever remained of the dangerous days leading up to the Blood Moon's arrival. Caldwell's warning proved prophetic sooner than anyone anticipated. Within hours of his detention, Aldrich's guards uncovered evidence of a second conspirator, embedded deep within the palace staff, a longtime servant named Doran, who had quietly been passing information to Thornwood contacts for even longer than Caldwell's own involvement. The discovery sent a fresh wave of urgency through the palace, as Ronan realized the conspiracy against him, and Illyra ran deeper and wider than initially believed. "We need to assume Thornwood still has active plans for tonight," Aldrich reported grimly, standing before Ronan in the same private study where Caldwell had been confronted just hours earlier. "Doran has confirmed under questioning that a small group of Thornwood warriors has already crossed into our territory, positioned somewhere within striking distance of the palace, waiting for the Blood Moon to rise before making their move." "What's their objective?" Ronan asked, his mind racing through the implications of this new threat. "According to Doran, their primary target remains Illyra Marsh," Aldrich said. "Thornwood believes that eliminating her before the Blood Moon fully rises will prevent the prophecy from unfolding, ensuring Ashbourne remains vulnerable to their continued political pressure along our shared border." Illyra, who had insisted on being present for this briefing, despite Ronan's continued reservations about her safety, felt a chill settle over her at this confirmation of the danger still surrounding them. "How do we stop them?" she asked, her voice steady, despite the fear building within her chest. Ronan's expression hardened with determination. "We prepare for a direct confrontation, but on our own terms, rather than allowing them to strike unexpectedly. I want every available guard positioned throughout the palace grounds by nightfall, and I want Illyra moved to the most secure location within the palace, somewhere Thornwood warriors would struggle to reach, even if they managed to breach our outer defenses." "With respect, my king," Illyra interjected, "hiding me away didn't stop the first assassination attempt, and I doubt it will fully guarantee my safety this time either. If Thornwood is determined enough to send warriors directly into our territory, they'll find some way to reach me regardless of where I'm hidden." Ronan turned to face her fully, understanding the validity of her concern, even as his protective instincts continued warring against the practical wisdom of her words. "What are you suggesting instead?" "I'm suggesting we use their expectations against them," Elira said, her mind working through a strategy that had been forming since Aldrich first revealed the extent of the ongoing threat. "If they expect to find me hidden away in some secure chamber, then perhaps we create exactly that expectation, while I remain somewhere they wouldn't think to search, ready to assist if needed, rather than simply waiting helplessly for danger to find me regardless." Aldrich considered this proposal thoughtfully. "It's a reasonable strategy, my king. We could position a decoy within the expected secure chamber, while Elira remains in a genuinely unexpected location, perhaps disguised among the guards themselves, or positioned within the healer's tents, where her medical knowledge could prove valuable if warriors are injured during the confrontation." Ronan remained hesitant, though he recognized the wisdom in the plan, even as every protective instinct within him rebelled against placing Elira anywhere near potential danger. "I don't like it," he admitted finally, "but I understand the logic. If we can control the narrative of where you're expected to be, we maintain an advantage that pure hiding wouldn't provide." The remainder of the day passed in careful preparation, guards positioning themselves strategically throughout the palace grounds while maintaining an appearance of normal routine to avoid alerting any remaining Thornwood contacts still embedded within the staff. Elira spent the afternoon within the healer's tents, gathering supplies and preparing remedies that might prove necessary if the confrontation resulted in injuries among Ronan's guards, finding a strange comfort in returning to the familiar work that had defined her life before everything changed so dramatically. As evening approached and the first hints of the rising blood moon began casting their crimson light across the horizon, tension throughout the palace reached a fever pitch. Ronan moved through the grounds with careful purpose, checking guard positions, reviewing final preparations, his mind constantly returning to concerns about Elira's safety, despite her insistence on playing an active role in whatever confrontation awaited them. The attack came just as the blood moon reached its full crimson glory, casting an eerie red light across the palace grounds that seemed to intensify the already tense atmosphere. Thornwood warriors emerged from the shadows near the palace's eastern wall, moving with the coordinated precision of trained fighters rather than the desperate improvisation of ordinary raiders. Ronan's guards, prepared for exactly this possibility, engaged immediately, the clash of steel against steel echoing across the grounds as the confrontation Caldwell had warned them about finally unfolded. Elira, positioned within the healer's tents as planned, felt her heart racing as the sounds of battle grew closer, guards falling back toward the tents as Thornwood warriors pushed forward with determined aggression. She gathered her prepared remedies, ready to assist any wounded fighters who might need immediate treatment, when a sudden commotion near the tent entrance drew her attention. 3 Thornwood warriors burst through the canvas flap, clearly having somehow identified the healer's tents as more than simple medical facilities. Elira's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the calculating look in their eyes, understanding immediately that their strategy of misdirection had somehow failed, that these warriors knew exactly who they were looking for. "The Omega Girl," one of the warriors said, his voice cold and businesslike, despite the chaos of battle continuing outside. "Thornwood offers substantial reward for your capture, or your death if capture proves too difficult." Elira backed away slowly, her mind racing through possible escape routes, while simultaneously calculating whether any of her prepared remedies might serve as improvised weapons against trained warriors. Her hand closed around a vial of concentrated wolfsbane extract, normally used in carefully diluted doses for treating certain ailments, but potent enough in its raw form to cause serious harm if used offensively. "You won't find me an easy target," she said, her voice steadier than she felt internally, buying time while she considered her limited options. The warriors advanced further into the tent, clearly unconcerned by an Omega's supposed inability to defend herself effectively. But Elira had spent months preparing for exactly this kind of danger, ever since the night in Blackridge Woods had taught her that her own survival could not depend entirely on others' protection. As the nearest warrior lunged forward, Elira threw the vial of concentrated wolfsbane directly at his face, the potent extract causing immediate and severe irritation that sent him stumbling backward with a pained howl. The distraction bought her precious seconds, enough time to grab a second prepared vial and a small blade she kept hidden among her healing supplies for emergency situations, exactly like this one. The remaining two warriors, momentarily startled by their companion's unexpected incapacitation, hesitated just long enough for the sound of approaching guards to reach the tent, Ronan's voice carrying clearly above the continuing chaos of battle outside. "Illyra," he called, his voice carrying unmistakable fear and urgency as he fought his way toward the healers' tents, guards clearing a path through the remaining Thornwood resistance. The warriors, realizing their position had become untenable with reinforcements arriving, made a hasty decision to retreat rather than risk capture themselves. Illyra watched them flee into the chaos of the continuing battle, her hands trembling now that the immediate danger had passed, adrenaline still coursing through her system as she processed how close she had come to serious harm. Ronan burst into the tent moments later, his expression shifting from fear to relief as he confirmed Illyra remained unharmed, despite the clear evidence of the confrontation that had just unfolded. He crossed the distance between them in quick strides, pulling her into an embrace that spoke more clearly than any words could, of the terror he had felt upon realizing Thornwood warriors had somehow located her despite their careful planning. "You're safe," he murmured against her hair, his voice rough with emotion. "I thought, when I heard warriors had breached the tents, I thought." "I'm safe," Illyra confirmed, her own voice unsteady, as she processed everything that had just occurred. "Thanks to the same preparation that saved your life in Blackridge Woods, it seems." Outside the tent, the sounds of battle were finally beginning to fade, Ronan's guards successfully repelling the Thornwood incursion, despite the unexpected challenge of warriors who had somehow anticipated Illyra's true location. As the crimson light of the blood moon continued casting its eerie glow across the palace grounds, Ronan held Illyra close, understanding now with absolute certainty that whatever the prophecy intended to reveal that night, his feelings for her had already been proven beyond any doubt through the shared dangers they had faced together. "The blood moon is at its peak," Illyra said softly, noticing the intense crimson light filtering through the tent's canvas walls. "Whatever the prophecy intends to reveal, I think we're about to find out." Ronan pulled back slightly, studying her face in the strange red light, feeling something shift within him, a certainty that had been building for weeks, finally crystallizing into absolute clarity. "Illyra Marsh," he said, his voice steady, despite the emotion evident beneath his words. "Whatever this blood moon reveals tonight, know that my choice was made long before its arrival. You are the mate my wolf has recognized, the partner my heart has chosen, regardless of prophecy or tradition, or anything this kingdom's council might say to oppose it." The following morning, as news of the failed Thornwood incursion spread throughout Ashbourne, the entire kingdom buzzed with an energy unlike anything Illyra had witnessed since her arrival at the palace. Guards spoke openly of the Omega girl who had defended herself against trained warriors within the healers' tents. Servants whispered with growing excitement about the crimson glow of the blood moon and what it might mean for the kingdom's future, and even some of the more traditional nobles found themselves reconsidering their previous objections, given the clear evidence of Illyra's capability and courage. Ronan called an emergency council meeting that afternoon, gathering the same elders who had voiced such strong opposition weeks earlier, when the possibility of Illyra's rise to Luna had first been discussed. This time, however, the atmosphere within the chamber felt markedly different, the events of the previous night having shifted the political landscape in ways that even the most stubborn traditionalists found difficult to ignore. "Before we begin," Ronan said, standing at the head of the council table, with Illyra seated beside him, a deliberate choice that immediately signaled his intentions to everyone present. "I want to address directly the conspiracy that nearly cost me my life months ago, and that attempted to eliminate Illyra Marsh just last night." He proceeded to lay out the full evidence gathered against Caldwell, the confirmed communications with Thornwood, the decades-old corruption involving Caldwell's father, and the destruction of Wren Marsh's reputation and career. The council listened in stunned silence as the pieces of a conspiracy they had never suspected came together before them, understanding now that their trusted advisor had been working against the kingdom's interests for far longer than anyone had realized. "Caldwell will face full justice for his betrayal," Ronan continued, "but I also want to address the matter that has caused such division within this council over recent months. The question of Illyra Marsh's position within this kingdom, and whether tradition should continue to prevent an Omega from rising to any position of genuine influence within Ashbourne." Miriam, the elder who had first shared the historical account of the previous blood moon prophecy, spoke up before Ronan could continue further. "My king, Given everything that transpired last night, given the clear pattern matching the events described in our historical records from a century earlier, I believe this council owes both you and Illyra Marsh a reconsideration of our previous objections." Other elders nodded in agreement, the events of the previous night having provided undeniable evidence of both the genuine threat facing the kingdom and Illyra's own remarkable capability in the face of that danger. Even those who had voiced the strongest traditional objections weeks earlier found themselves reconsidering positions that now seemed increasingly disconnected from the reality unfolding before them. "I intend to name Illyra Marsh as my Luna," Ronan announced, his voice carrying clearly throughout the council chamber. Not simply because ancient prophecy suggests this connection, and not simply because she has twice now proven herself willing to risk everything to protect this kingdom and its king. I intend to name her Luna because she represents exactly the qualities this kingdom needs moving forward. Courage without hesitation, integrity inherited from a mother who sacrificed everything for justice, and a genuine understanding of what it means to serve others, rather than simply accumulating power for its own sake. The council chamber fell silent as Ronan's words settled over the gathered elders, the weight of tradition finally giving way to the undeniable truth of everything that had transpired over recent months. One by one, the elders who had once voiced such strong opposition began nodding their agreement, understanding that whatever concerns they had once held about breaking centuries of tradition paled in comparison to the genuine threat their kingdom had faced, and the equally genuine strength Illyra had demonstrated in helping to overcome it. That evening, as the palace prepared for a formal ceremony that would announce Illyra's new position to the entire kingdom, she found herself standing alone in the same garden where she had first learned the truth about the blood moon prophecy from Ronan weeks earlier. The fountain trickled softly nearby, the same peaceful sound that had accompanied so many of their private conversations during the difficult months leading up to this moment. "Nervous?" Ronan's voice came from behind her, and she turned to find him approaching, dressed in formal ceremonial attire that somehow still carried the same warmth and familiarity she had grown to treasure over their months together. "Terrified," Illyra admitted with a small laugh. "A few months ago, I was an Omega working in the healer's tents, barely noticed by anyone within this kingdom. Now, I'm about to be formally announced as Luna before the entire pack." Ronan took her hands in his expression soft with affection and pride. "You've earned this position through actions that speak far louder than any bloodline or traditional training ever could. Every person within this kingdom who witnessed or heard about what happened last night understands that you belong here, not because prophecy demanded it, but because you've proven time and again that you possess exactly the strength and integrity this kingdom needs in its Luna." "My mother would be proud," Illyra said softly, thinking of Ren's own sacrifice decades earlier, a sacrifice that had gone unrecognized and unrewarded for so long, but that had ultimately shaped the daughter who now stood ready to claim a position of genuine influence within the very kingdom that had once cast her mother aside. "Your mother's courage lives on in you," Ronan agreed. "And starting tonight, this entire kingdom will finally understand the truth she always knew, that strength and worth come from character and courage, not from bloodline or rank determined by circumstances of birth." As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, casting long golden shadows across the palace gardens, Ronan and Illyra made their way toward the great hall, where the entire kingdom had gathered to witness the formal ceremony. Word had spread far and wide throughout Ashbourne about the events of the previous night, about the courage the Omega girl had shown in defending herself against trained warriors, about the ancient prophecy that seemed to be unfolding exactly as their historical records had described from a century earlier. The great hall fell silent as Ronan and Illyra entered together, walking side by side rather than the traditional formal procession that typically accompanied such ceremonies, a deliberate choice that reflected the equal partnership they intended to build together as King and Luna. Ronan addressed the assembled crowd with words that would be remembered and repeated throughout Ashbourne for generations to come. "For 3 years, I refused every candidate presented to me as a potential Luna, searching for something I couldn't quite name, something beyond bloodline or beauty or political advantage," he said, his voice carrying clearly throughout the packed hall. "I found that quality in Illyra Marsh, an Omega who threw herself between me and death without a moment's hesitation, who has since proven again and again that true strength comes not from rank or station, but from the courage to act rightly, regardless of personal cost. He turned to face Alira directly, his expression filled with the same warmth and certainty she had come to recognize during their months together. Alira Marsh, before this entire kingdom, I name you my Luna, my equal partner in leading Ashbourne forward into whatever challenges the future may bring. The crowd erupted into cheers, the previous weeks of uncertainty and division giving way to genuine celebration as the kingdom embraced the remarkable transformation that had unfolded before them. Alira felt tears of joy and relief filling her eyes as she looked out across the assembled faces, recognizing servants and guards and villagers who had once overlooked her entirely, now celebrating her rise to a position she had never imagined possible. As the formal ceremony concluded and the celebration continued long into the night, Alira stood beside Ronan, watching the kingdom she now called home, rejoice in a future that promised to look markedly different from the rigid traditions that had defined Ashbourne for generations. Whatever challenges still lay ahead, whatever remained of Thornwood's ambitions along their shared border, Alira felt confident that she and Ronan, together, possessed the strength and wisdom to face them. The Blood Moon prophecy had been fulfilled, not through mere chance or ancient magic, but through genuine sacrifice, unwavering courage, and a love that had grown stronger through every challenge they faced together. And as the crimson moon finally began its descent below the horizon, giving way to the softer light of an ordinary evening sky, Ashbourne stood transformed, ready to embrace a future built on the understanding that true worth comes not from the circumstances of one's birth, but from the strength of one's heart and the courage of one's actions when it matters most.